Okay, let's start today's session. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, guys, wherever you are. I'm Dr. Mustafa Rasulimanesh from School of Hospitality, Tourism and Events, Taylor's University. This session is a third session of online course on PLS using WarpPLS 7 software. And in this session, we are going to discuss mediator assessment and analysis. So we will try to discuss hypothesis development for mediator and some basic concept for hypothesis development. And then we'll go for a mediation assessment, and we will perform this analysis for assessment of mediator in WarpPLS software. Let me see presentation more. When we talk about mediator or mediating variable, actually we have a variable that this variable transmit the effect of an independent variable to dependent variable. So we need support from literature and theory for actually transmitting the effect of IV to DV. So actually it's not possible simply say when a variable locate between other two variables can be mediator. For mediator actually hypothesis, we need the support from literature, and we need to confirm that this variable has a role between two variables between IV and DV, and they can play this role to transmit the effect of IV to DV. Actually, when we have the mediator, mediator can explain the mechanism of effect of IV to DV. Sometimes effect of IV on DV, we have some support from the literature, theory, and previous study for effect of IV to DV. But this effect, the mechanism of this effect is not clear. So we introduce mediator to clarify this effect, to clarify the way that effect of IV actually the transfer to DV, IV influence on DV. Mediation variable and mediation analysis is one of the most common type of variable in different disciplines. And actually when we include mediator, simple cause and effect relationship change to a bit more complex. Because when a variable comes between IV and DV, we need to explain, and we actually, if we confirm mediator, we have some justification how IV can influence on DV. Here there is a very simple example, a traditional example for understanding mediator. For example, if we have effect of the seawater temperature on number of incidents, and support this effect, but the mechanism of this effect is not clear. We actually don't know clearly why seawater temperature can influence on number of incidents. If we introduce a mediator between these two variables, and this variable is number of swimmers, we can understand the mechanism of effect of seawater temperature on number of incidents. So seawater temperature influence on number of swimmers, and number of swimmers influence on the number of incidents. So by introducing this mediation variable, we can understand the mechanism of this. This happened in many disciplines and different actually areas and studies, right? For example, for the example that we worked in this workshop, and actually we already worked in previous sessions. If we have in the literature, we have many of literature that focus on effect of some antecedent on support for tourism development, and also perception of resident toward tourism development. Many different antecedents actually they have introduced in the literature, like community attachment, like attitude, environmental attitude, cultural attitude, and economic gain. That the literature introduced these antecedents that influence on perception of resident about tourism development. And there are plenty of literature that discuss perception of resident toward tourism development, influence on support for tourism development. Right. So we have this literature. Also, we have some literature that discuss effect of this antecedent on support. Okay, when we introduce, but actually there is lack of study. When we go to the literature, there are 1,000 papers that discuss this one. But there is very few study, that our study is one of these few that we published in 2020, that actually investigate the mediation role of this perception between these antecedent and support. When we introduce a resident perception between antecedent and support, it means we believe the mechanism of effect of antecedent on support can be through perception, community attachment, environmental attitude, cultural attitude. Increasing these variable, these antecedent, will increase perception of resident toward tourism. So by improving perception of resident, their support for tourism development will increase. So based on this, we can understand, okay, if these factors, these antecedents influence on support, the mechanism of this influence is through perception. So when their perception increase, so they will support will increase. So this is the way that we can understand the role of mediator. So if we want to include a mediator in our framework, we need to, and we want to develop a mediation hypothesis. Based on this rationale and based on this logic, we need to justify this indirect effect or transmitting effect of IV to DV through mediator. And based on this rationale and support from literature and theory, we can hypothesize mediator. So it's not possible only simply put a variable between two other variable, IV and DV, and say this variable can be mediator and you want to test this mediator. We need support from literature and theory. We have different types of mediator. This can be a simple mediator that only we have one mediator, one variable between IV and DV, and also can be a complex mediator that we have multiple variable, multiple mediator, that this can, and these multiple mediator can be serial like this one, or can be parallel, or a bit more complex like model D that we have we have two mediator and the few pad mediation. Okay. But before going to different tests for assessment of mediator, I want to actually a bit discuss about hypothesis development for mediator. Let me go through our recent paper that we published in Journal of Travel Research, and let me explain this hypothesis development process based on this table, based on this paper. This is a paper that we published in Journal of Travel Research in 2020. And the main objective of this paper is assessing the mediating role of the resident perception between antecedent and the tourism development. As I mentioned, in this area, if you search for resident perception, there are many papers on resident perception from 1990. But still, we managed to publish this paper in Journal of Travel Research. Journal of Travel Research is one of the top in tourism. If I'm not mistaken, now is the second journal in tourism and the hospitality field, right? So how actually we could manage to publish this paper? Because we justify mediation effect is not, we have many models that published so far for this resident perception, that this model actually, and those papers put resident perception between some antecedent and support. But the difference between our paper, that based on this difference we could manage to publish, they didn't discuss and they didn't hypothesize the mediator. But in this paper we try to do, and based on this we justify originality of this paper. Okay, so in this paper we try to justify mediation role of resident perception between these antecedent and support for tourism development. But how we justify this mediation role? Actually, when we say mediation variable, mediator, we believe mediator come between IV and DV. Come between IV and DV. And this variable is supposed to transfer the effect of IV to DV. I mean hypothesis development level, not assessment. Later we will go for assessment. So we believe that this variable can come between IV and DV. Okay, so it means we believe based on literature and based on theory, there is effect, there is support for effect of IV on DV. I don't want to hypothesize IV to DV, and it's not compulsory to hypothesize. I'm talking about support from literature and from theory for the effect of IV to DV. Total, not direct or indirect. I don't talk about direct or indirect effect. And I don't talk about hypothesis development for direct effect, right? So based on literature, we need to have support from theory and previous studies for the effect of IV to DV. So when we want to hypothesize mediation role of M between X and Y, we have support from literature and from theory that X has effect on Y. Okay, what we did in this paper, we justify effect of these antecedents, for example, community attachment to support based on theory and based on previous study. We justify this relationship, we justify this effect, not hypothesis. We justify this effect theoretically based on social exchange theory. So we have many evidences that these antecedents can influence on support based on social exchange theory. And we have many previous studies to support this effect, not hypothesis, to support this total effect. So first step for justification of mediator is to have support from the literature and from the theory, specific theory for the effect of IV to EV. Total. Another one, when we want to justify effect of resident perception between community attachment and support. So believe effect of community attachment first transfer to resident perception means community attachment effect on resident perception, and then resident perception effect on support. So for these two, we need to have support from the literature and the theory. Again, I'm not talking about assessment and Boron and Kenny approach. Boron and Kenny approach is something for assessment of mediator. Later I will go through. But this is for hypothesis development. Okay, so in this paper, we apply Weber theory. We apply Weber theory to support effect of antecedent on resident perception based on literature, social exchange theory, and based on these two theories, social exchange theory and Weber theory, to support total effect of IV to DV and effect of IV to mediator and mediator to DV. After supporting these effects, so we hypothesize mediator. If we have support for effect of IV to DV, IV to M, and M to DV, so we can say resident perception can be mediator between IV and DV. So to hypothesize mediation, to hypothesize mediator, we need to support from the literature. We need theoretical support to justify effect of IV to DV, IV to M, and M to DV. This is something similar to steps by Boron and Kenny, but Boron and Kenny suggested these steps for assessment of mediator that is no more acceptable. And recent literature actually criticized this approach and showed this approach is a very low power approach for assessment of mediator. But these steps can be used for hypothesis development based on rationale behind mediator. Because mediator, when we say mediator, means we have a variable between IV and DV. So IV to DV should be justified based on theory, and also IV to M or M to DV, right? So this is the way that we can hypothesize mediator. So we need to write mediation hypothesis. Mediator assessment is not only post hoc analysis that after developing our hypothesis, in analysis part, only we try to test, and based on result, we come out with some conclusion. If you want to test hypothesis, if you want to test mediator, you have to hypothesize and then test in analysis part, right? Using different analysis, using different method and different software you can perform, and you can assess mediation. But it's different different with hypothesis development. Okay, so we need to be very careful about hypothesis development for Mediator. If you want to know about this process, you can go through this paper and see the process that we apply for hypothesis development of Mediator. Okay, let me go through. Okay. Okay. When we hypothesize the mediator, now we want to assess mediator. For assessment of mediator, actually, there are different methods and different tests for assessment of mediator. McKinnon 2002 categorized many of these tests under three main categories. And these three main categories are causal steps. So we have some steps and we need to test these steps to come out and to assess a mediator. Second group is the difference between direct effect before and after including mediator. And the third one is assessment of indirect effect or product coefficient of indirect effect of x to m and m to y, independent variable, independent to m and m to dependent variable, right? X to m and m to y. So this study, McKinnon 2002, tried to categorize all these steps under these three categories. The most common approach for assessment of mediator, that is Baron and Kenny, actually is categorized under first group, but is not only method under first group. Under first group also we have another test, another method. But Baron and Kenny is most well-known method under first group. Also, we have some tests under second group and third groups based on this study. Baron and Kenny, for testing mediator, suggest to assess direct effect before including. So if direct effect before including is significant, we need to test after including mediator, we need to test effect of independent variable x to m and also m to y, and all of these should be significant to conclude that this mediator is acceptable and significant mediator. So we need to test these steps based on Baron and Kenny. We need to test, statistically test, right? So when we test these three steps, we can conclude the M is mediator between X to Y. But actually recent studies, especially the study by Hayes and Schwarzkopf 2013, revealed that Baron and Kenny is one of the method, one of the approach with very low power for assessment of mediator. So based on their work, Baron and Kenny actually is no more acceptable method for assessment of mediator. Also, there are some method under other group, under second and third group. Under third group, product of coefficient that we calculate AB, we calculate effect of x to m and m to y. This term is product of coefficient term. So we assess significance of this term. The test, actually the group of tests that belong to third group are, there are various tests under third group. right? For example, Sobel test is one of the tests under delta method. Under delta method, we have some tests for assessment of significance of indirect effect. We have the percentile and bias corrected bootstrap confidence interval, again for assessment of significance of indirect effect. A distribution of product, Monte Carlo joint significance. So there are a different method under group 3. Under group 3, all these methods under group 3. For example, here you can see under delta method, we have a few tests, not only Sobel tests. We have Orion test, we have Goodman test. So there are different formula to calculate significance of indirect effect. But based on Hayes and Schwarzkopf 2013, also Sobel test and this group of delta tests are the least powerful and trustworthy method for assessment of mediator. So for assessment of mediator, this study reject application of Baron and Kinney and application of Sobel test for group 1 and group 3. So combination of these two, let's say bad method or not acceptable method cannot create an acceptable method, a good method, right? So if you apply Baron and Kinney and want to be safer and apply also Sobel test and combine these two, it doesn't mean that you actually can come out with an acceptable method, acceptable approach. These two approach based on this Hayes and Schwarzkopf is not acceptable anymore, right? So it's not a trustworthy method. But what is the best method? The best method based on this simulation is calculation of confidence interval using bias corrected bootstrap or percentile bootstrap. So the best method is assessment of significance of indirect effect using resampling method and using bootstrapping. So this is the best method for assessment of mediator. Actually, because this term is a non-parametric term, AB. And for this non-parametric test, non-parametric term, if we use parametric test like Sobel test, we cannot get valid and trustworthy result. And we have to apply non-parametric method for assessment of significance of this non-parametric term. So, and bootstrapping is or resampling calculation of the confidence interval using bootstrapping is a non-parametric method. So it's suitable for testing significance of indirect. So among all these tests, the best method for assessment of mediator is product of coefficient, assessment of significance of product of coefficient using bootstrapping, right? And Baron and Kinney for testing mediator is not acceptable method. So here we discuss about testing, we discuss about assessment of mediator. In last phase, actually we discuss about hypothesis development. So you have to differentiate these two different phases. First, you have to hypothesize your mediator. And then you need to find a suitable method for assessment of mediator and a software to perform this method. For example, if you choose the bias corrected bootstrap or percentile bootstrap, you can choose process, right, to test the indirect effect using this method. You can choose other software. right? Also in WarpPLS, you can assess indirect effect using this non-parametric test, non-parametric methods, right? Okay, and this diagram from Zhao is a very good diagram to understand and to interpret Mediator. Actually, when we skip Baron and Kinney approach and don't use Baron and Kinney approach, we don't interpret and we don't discuss anymore about full and partial mediation or mediator, right? Because full and partial mediation is for application of Baron and Kinney. When we apply Baron and Kinney at the end, we check direct effect and significance of direct effect and compare with the indirect effect. So we can come out with the partial and full mediation. But when we apply product of coefficient and assess significance of indirect effect, actually we don't discuss and we don't use these terms. We don't use full and partial mediation. But this Zhao diagram is very helpful. In this diagram, in this paper, actually, recommend this diagram for interpretation of mediator. Okay, if A and B, if A multiply B, product of coefficient or indirect term, is significant, so we can conclude that M is mediator between X and Y. But if it's not significant, okay, if it's not significant, so we don't have mediator. We don't have significant. Okay, here, if it's not significant, okay, we don't have mediator and we don't need to interpret anything. But if it's significant, so we go to this path. If AB is significant, means we have mediator and M mediates effect of X on B, X on Y, X on Y. But when we have significant mediator, we can do some interpretation. We can do some interpretation here. Okay, if we have direct effect, so direct effect include in our framework based on hypothesis that we have, it's not necessary to include, but if we have, based on the significance of direct effect, we can have different interpretation. If direct effect is not significant, so it means we have only indirect effect, only we have mediator. And effect of X, total effect of X, transfer to Y through M. So only we have indirect effect and mediator. But if direct effect is significant, based on the sign of direct effect and the indirect effect, we can have two types of mediator. If sign of indirect effect and the direct effect are identical, same, so it means A, B, C is positive, A, B is negative, and C also is negative. So A, B, C is positive. So it means the sign of A, B, and C, direct effect, are same. So this mediator is complementary mediator. But if the sign of A, B, and C are different, indirect effect is positive, but direct effect is negative, or indirect effect is negative, but direct effect is positive, right? So the sign of these two paths are different. So this mediator is competitive. So it means direct effect and indirect effect compete to transfer effect of X to Y. But if the sign of these two are same, both positive and negative, means they are complementary. Mediator is complementary. So based on this, actually we can discuss and interpret result of indirect effect and mediator. Okay. This is a very good paper actually published by Christian Itzel and Jose Roland and Gabriel Cepeda. So it's a very good paper for understanding and assessment of, especially assessment of mediator in the context of PLS. And this is the paper that I showed you, we recently published. This is not methodological paper. This is actually the theoretical paper, but research paper, but we discuss in detail the way of hypothesis development of mediator and also assessment. So you can refer to this paper. Okay. Let me go through software. Any questions so far? Let me go to software. You can see the software?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, Pablo. Yes.
Okay. So this is WarpPLS software that in previous session we used for creating model and assessment of measurement model and structural model. And also last week we discussed assessment of higher order construct using this software. So in this software, there are 5 simple steps to create model and perform SEM analysis, PLS analysis. I'm not going to go through these steps, but so I already created the model here. When you create a model in a step 1 and read data in a step 2 and do some pre-process analysis for data in a step 3, you can generate your standardized data and go to step 4 to define your SEM model. So I already created my model here. Okay, in this model, we have 3 antecedents: community attachment, economic gain, environmental attitude. And we have resident perception, economic perception toward tourism development, and we have support. So we hypothesize indirect effect of these 3 antecedents on support through economic perception or perceived economic impact of tourism or economic perception. So we hypothesize these 3 hypotheses. So here we have only 3 hypotheses. Hypothesis is based on your objective. If your objective only is to hypothesize and to test mediation between antecedent and dependent variable, you can only have mediation hypothesis. It's not necessary to have direct effect of these three antecedent on IV, on mediator, and mediator to DV is not necessary to have. But based on your objective, you can have both hypotheses: direct effect, direct effect of antecedent to mediator, mediator to DV, and also indirect effect of antecedent to DV through mediator. So it's possible to have, but depends on your objective. What the objective of your study want, right? What objective you want to address. So hypothesis development is based on objective of your study. Here, only I have three mediator, three indirect effect, and three mediation hypotheses. I have one mediator, but three IV and one DV. So I have three paths, three indirect paths, and three mediation hypotheses. Okay. So this is my model and created it. When we create model in this step, in WarpPLS, we have to save model and close it. And go to step 5, perform SEM analysis. Okay, here we have result of our model, result of assessment of our model. So when we want to assess mediator, like other PLS models and other PLS analysis, first step, we have to report result of assessment of measurement model. So if our variable, our construct, or reflective, we need to assess result of CR, AVE, discriminant validity, convergent validity. So we need to check reliability and validity before going to a structural level, right? So after reporting a measurement model, we are going to second step for assessment of structural model and assessment of mediation and testing hypothesis, result of testing hypothesis. Okay, to get result of indirect effect for these three mediation hypotheses, if we click on view, here we have an option for indirect and total effect. So if we click on, we have two types of viewing of result, table view and classic view. So if we click on this table view, we can see the result of indirect effect. You can follow. So to actually check the result of indirect effect or significance of product of coefficient, you need to go to this indirect and total effect result. Okay, here you have actually very rich results for assessment of mediator in this table. Okay, the first part, you can see indirect effect for paths with two segments. Two segments means mediator or indirect effect only with one mediator. So when we have only one mediator, X to mediator, X to M, and M to Y. So we have two segments. So this is the result for two segments indirect effect in our model. Right? Okay. So if you actually check the result here, you can see effect of these three antecedent. We have three independent variables: community attachment, economic gain, and environmental attitude to support, right? So this is indirect effect with two segments. Indirect effect with two segments means these effects are, the first one is the result of EA, environmental attitude, resident perception, and support. So this is for this one, because this result is indirect effect of EA to support. Another one is EG to support, economic gain to support. So we have economic gain, resident perception, support. Another one is CA to support. So we have CA, resident perception, and support, right? So we have three indirect effects here. We have three indirect effects here. So this is result of the product of coefficient or indirect effect for three hypotheses, right? And if you scroll down, okay, here you can see p-value for indirect effect. So this is indirect effect, and this is p-value. Here you can see a standard error and effect size. This is something that is unique in WarpPLS. You don't have effect size for indirect effect in other software. So here, for assessment of Mediator, you can get the value of indirect effect here, the value of indirect effect. You can report p-value, significance of indirect effect, and you can report effect size for three indirect effects. So based on this result, the effect of environmental attitude to support through resident perception is highest effect, and but the three indirect effects are significant. Here you can see three indirect effects are significant, and the highest effect size for these indirect effects belong to environmental attitude. So also you can report these three effect size for indirect effect, aligned with the direct effect, because you also have the direct effect and direct hypothesis. If you hypothesize direct effect, you can report effect size for both indirect effect and direct effect for hypothesis, direct hypothesis and mediation hypothesis. Okay, so you can get result of Mediator from this table. Okay, if I go back to this model and go to step 4, now I want to add one more mediator in this model, serial mediator, right? Okay, let me create the new mediator, and this new mediator is participation. Participation, and the participation has 4 items. So save this one. Okay, and the participation come between perception and support. So here I have Okay, so now we have two mediators. We have two mediators. But of course, when we add this second mediator and we want to hypothesize the effect of this antecedent on support through both mediator, we need more support, theoretical support from literature for this relationship, not for hypothesizing this relationship, to hypothesize mediation role of these two between antecedent and DV. Okay, if, for example, I connect also this one to support, if only I want to hypothesize mediation, here I can hypothesize six mediator or six mediation paths. That's six mediator, six mediation paths and hypotheses, right? So what are these six? Okay, this is one, right? This is two, and this is three. So we have three mediation hypothesis through perception. And this is another hypothesis that these two mediator come between IV and DV. So this hypothesis is community attachment has indirect effect on support through perception and participation. So we have two mediators, and economic gain and environmental attitude. So we have six hypotheses, six mediation hypotheses, right? And we want to test this, we want to test these hypotheses, these mediation hypotheses in this framework. Okay, so again, save our model and close. Proceed to, okay. Now here we have result. Again, you need to assess measurement model and then go to hypothesis test.
Sorry, sir.
Go to view and yes, indirect. Yes.
We don't need to hypothesize the relation between the two mediators, between the first mediator and the second one. We don't need to. Okay.
No, we don't. This depends on your objective.
Okay, only between independent variables and dependent variables.
Everything depends on your objective.
Okay.
If your objective wants all relationship, okay, you have to hypothesize. If your objective, your research objective only focus on mediator, okay, you can focus on mediator, right? So it depends on your objective. But for hypothesizing mediator, you need support from the literature for total effect of IV to DV and theoretical support for total effect of IV to DV, IV to M1, M1 to M2, and M2 to Y. Only theoretical support. Don't need to hypothesize it, right? But you need to justify based on, you need the theoretical support for this actually the relationship based on previous study and based on theory. Is it clear? So it's two different things.
I'm a little bit confused because when we look at the model, we see a relationship between the two mediators.
You can see, but you are not supposed to
hypothesize
model. You are not supposed to develop your model based on the value that you get from analysis. Your hypothesis development and the framework should be based on your objective and then based on theory and literature.
Okay.
Right?
Fine, thank you.
Okay. So when we perform analysis, we need to go to view again, this indirect effect and total effect. Okay. Here we have indirect effect for pads with 2 segments. But for these 2 segments, we have more values here. Right? Actually, this is correct. Because between also CA and participation, we have 2 segment indirect effect. But we don't need this one. We don't need, because we didn't hypothesize this mediation hypothesis. So we don't report this result. Okay? Because these 2 segments are between IV perception and participation. We don't want this one. For 2 segments, only we need the value of indirect effect between IV and DV support through participation. So we don't need we don't need result of indirect effect of CA to participation, right? So only we get result of this part. We don't need this one. Only these 3. Okay, these 3. Community attachment to support. Community attachment, resident perception support, economic gain, resident perception support, and environmental attitude, resident perception and support. And you can get also for this indirect effect with 2 paths, you can get p-value here, p-value of indirect effect with 2 segments. And you can get effect size here with 2 segments. So we don't need to report another indirect effect with 2 segments because this is between IV and participation. And we didn't hypothesize this indirect effect. Okay? So this is 3 first mediation hypotheses: IV, perception, and support. We have 3 more hypotheses: IV, perception, participation. 2 hypotheses, 2 mediator, and support. So we need these 3 hypotheses: community attachment, perception, participation, support, environmental attitude, perception, participation, support, and economic gain, perception, participation, and support. So for these 3 hypotheses, indirect effect include 3 segments, right? Indirect effect include 3 segments: A, B, C. So we need to calculate A significance of A, B, C. A1, B1, C1, A2, B1, C1, and A3, B1, C1, right? So for these three hypotheses, we need to check indirect effect with 3 segments between antecedent and support. 1, 2, 3. 3 segments. So if we go to result and scroll down, okay, here you can see indirect effect for pads with 3 segments. Indirect effect for pads with 3 segments. So this is the value of indirect effect for 3 segments with 3 pads, right? So this is the value of indirect effect, and you can see p-value, but none of p-value of indirect effect with 2 mediators are significant. So none of them are significant, and so no need to check effect size, but actually if you want, you can see effect size. The effect size of each pad is very low, right? Because it's not significant. P-value is higher than 0.05, right? So here you can check second 3 hypotheses. Hypothesis with 2 mediator. Hypothesis with 2 mediator using these 3 segment, with 3 segments indirect effect. So this is actually the way that we can use WarpPLS for this type of complex mediator or serial mediator. Okay. Another one, what if we have parallel mediator? If we go to step 4 again, but let me delete this participation and add one more variable. One more variable, create, okay, resident perception, but this time social effect. So we have another dimension of resident perception. Okay, so when we click on this tree and right, so when we create new mediator, so we have now 2 mediator, but parallel mediator, M1 and M2. M1 and M2 together transfer effect of IV to DV. So now we have 6, again, we have 6 mediation hypotheses. 3 indirect effect through economic perspective or economic perception, and 3. So we have 6 hypotheses, right? We have 6 hypotheses, 6 mediation hypotheses. Okay, now we again save model and go to step 5. Okay, and indirect effect. Here we have indirect effect for pads with two segments. So we have indirect effect with two segments, environmental attitude to support, right? And economic gain to support, and community attachment to support. So we have these three values for indirect effect with two segments. But here, there is one difference between this model and the previous one. Previous one, indirect effect with two segments was, for each one, was only one indirect effect and one pad between each IV and DV, between community attachment and support. Only we had one indirect effect with two segments. But now we have two number of pads with two segments between IV and DV. We have two pads. Okay. Actually, this is right. For each one, we have two pads. Community attachment, this is indirect effect with the two segment, and this is indirect effect with two segment. So we have two indirect effects. The value of indirect effect here, the value of indirect effect here is for two indirect effects together. So here we have total indirect effect with two paths from IV to DV. Indirect effect through economic perception and indirect effect through social perception. These two together are significant, and here again you can see effect size. But we need separate indirect effect. We need the value of indirect effect for each mediator. So when we have this type of parallel mediator, we need to do something to get value of indirect effect for each path. Value of indirect effect for each path. We need actually to go to a step 4 and delete one of the connection. Delete one of the link. So delete this link. When delete this link, software will give us only the effect of IV to DV with two segments through economic perception. So we need to isolate these two indirect effects. So we save model, and if we go to indirect effects, okay, so you can see indirect effect has changed, because now only we have one pad with two segments. So this is a pad between environmental attitude, perception, and the support, economic perception, economic gain, economic perception and support, community attachment, economic perception and support. And we can get the result of the p-value and also effect size for this path. Then we need to, when we save this result and report this result, we need to go back to our model and repeat these steps for another path. So we need to put back this effect and delete this direct effect, save model, and perform analysis, and then we can go to indirect effect and total effect. Okay, now this indirect effect is only for social perception. So this one is for environmental attitude, social perception and support, economic gain, social perception and support, and community attachment, social perception and support. And we can report p-value and effect size for these three indirect effect, or for these three mediation hypotheses. So we can report result of the mediation assessment for this parallel mediator, and we can report based on the value of indirect effect and this p-value to check significance of indirect effect and effects. So this is for parallel mediator. So by using this segments, 2 segment, 3 segment, if you have more mediator, so you can get the result of different paths and different mediation paths based on these 2 segment or 3 segment, 4 segment, if you add more mediation between IV and DV. And also you can get, for all these situations, you can get total effect. You can get total effect, and if you scroll down here, you can see total effect of IV to DV. But of course, when you go to total effect, also you can get direct effect from here. For example, for this environmental attitude and the support, okay, this one include indirect effect, direct effect, and any number of indirect effect that you have. For example, if you have 2 indirect effect, right, this will include indirect effect, and if you have also direct effect, this will be total effect, including all effects from IV to DV. For example, if I add to this model, I put back this one, and addition to this mediator, I need and also hypothesize based on our objective. We need the direct effect. So we have to if based on our objective, we need also to hypothesize this direct effect. So our model seems like this. And when save and close, okay, so this is our result. And when we go to indirect effect and total effect, here we can see the result with the 2 segments, including p-value, standard error, and effect size. Result of total indirect effect. So we have 2 indirect effect together from between IV and DV. And also we have total effect. Here, total effect between EA, environmental attitude, and support, you can see is very strong, because this one includes direct, 2 direct, direct and 2 indirect effects. So this total effect here, you can get for all effects that come from IV to DV. And for this total effect, you can get the result, addition to the value of total effect, you can get p-value, standard error, and also effect size for total effect. Effect size for total effect of IV to DV. Actually, sometimes we hypothesize total effect. I have a paper I published in 2015. Effect of leadership on ownership, effect of some dimension of leadership on ownership. So we hypothesize leadership influence on ownership through some mediator and by indirect and direct effect. But actually, my hypothesis and based on my objective was effect of leadership to ownership. So I needed to test this total effect. Doesn't matter, this total effect come through mediator, go directly or indirectly. But I want to test this total effect, right? So sometimes we have to hypothesize these type of effect, right? Okay, if we hypothesize in this way and we need to check total effect, we can get total effect from this type. Okay, that's all for mediation hypothesis and mediation assessment in WarpPLS. Now we can go for your question course on WarpPLS. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Today's session.
Thank you, sir. Have a good day.
Thank you so much for this session. Thank you.